May 20th, 1943, a U.S. military supply depot in North Africa, when German Fallschirmjäger, Hitler's elite paratroopers, dropped from the sky expecting an easy target. They never imagined the weapon that would decimate their assault force. It wasn't bullets, grenades, or artillery. It was 300 gallons of boiling frying oil wielded by a 34-year-old cook from Kentucky named Sergeant James "Jimmy" Caldwell. In 25 minutes of absolute chaos, one man's desperate improvisation would scald 160 enemy soldiers, halt an elite airborne assault, and prove that war's heroes don't always carry rifles. But the horror of what Jimmy unleashed that day would haunt him for the rest of his life. May 20th, 1943. 04:47 hours, Allied Supply Depot, Baker 7, 18 miles southeast of Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The temperature inside the mess tent was already climbing toward 90 degrees, and dawn hadn't broken yet. Sergeant James Caldwell wiped sweat from his forehead with a grease-stained towel, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of a man who'd fried 400 breakfasts a day for the past 8 months. The industrial fryers, massive steel vats, each holding 50 gallons of oil, hissed and bubbled at 375 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of rendered fat hung thick in the desert air. Jimmy was 34 years old, 5'9", 160 pounds soaking wet, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slid down his nose. Before Pearl Harbor, he'd run a diner called Caldwell's Corner in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Population 12,000. He served biscuits and gravy, fried chicken and sweet tea to farmers and factory workers. His life had been simple, predictable, safe. Then, December 7th, 1941, changed everything. Like millions of Americans, Jimmy tried to enlist the next day. The recruiter took one look at his glasses, his slight build, his 34 years, and nearly laughed him out of the office. "We need fighters, not fry cooks," the man had said. But Jimmy persisted. 6 visits later, they gave him a uniform and assigned him to the Quartermaster Corps. Not as a soldier, as a cook. Now he stood in the middle of the North African desert, 5,000 miles from Kentucky, feeding American soldiers fighting Rommel's Africa Corps. Supply Depot. Baker 7 was a sprawling complex of canvas tents, wooden crates, fuel drums, ammunition stockpiles, and the massive kitchens that fed 2,000 men daily. The depot sat in a shallow valley surrounded by rocky hills, strategically positioned but tactically vulnerable. Intelligence had assured them the front lines were 40 miles north. They'd been wrong before. The garrison defending Baker 7 consisted of exactly 47 combat personnel, 1 understrength rifle platoon, 3 officers, a medical team, and support staff. The rest, cooks, clerks, mechanics, drivers, had never fired their weapons outside of basic training. Jimmy's M1 Garand rifle hung on a tent pole, ammunition still in the factory wrapper. He'd fired it exactly twice, both times missing the target completely. The operation around him was a symphony of American industrial efficiency under impossible pressure. Refrigeration trucks, running on diesel generators that consumed 60 gallons daily, kept meat from spoiling in 110-degree heat. Water was rationed at 2 gallons per man per day, trucked in from wells 30 miles away. The kitchens operated 18 hours daily, burning through 500 pounds of flour, 300 pounds of meat, 800 eggs. Every calorie had to be shipped across the Atlantic, transported through hostile waters where U-boats sank 20% of convoy ships, then trucked across hundreds of miles of desert. Jimmy had 6 industrial fryers running that morning, preparing for breakfast service at a 6:00. Each fryer held 50 gallons of oil, 300 gallons total, kept at precise temperatures for frying potatoes, chicken, donuts. The oil was liquid gold in the supply chain, expensive, difficult to transport, rationed carefully. Wasting it was a court-martial offense. His assistant, Private Eddie Morrison from Detroit, 19 years old, drafted 6 months ago, was slicing 200 pounds of potatoes when the first sound reached them. A low drone, distant but growing, aircraft engines. Eddie looked up, knife paused mid-slice. Breakfast delivery? Jimmy stepped outside the tent, squinting at the pre-dawn sky. The stars were fading, eastern horizon glowing pale orange. The sound was wrong. Too many engines, wrong pitch. American C-47 transports had a distinctive rumble. This was sharper, more aggressive. Then he saw them. Black shapes against the lightening sky. Dozens of aircraft in tight formation, flying low and fast from the northwest. Jimmy's blood turned cold. Those weren't American planes. The air raid siren began wailing, a mechanical scream that split the dawn silence. Men poured from tents, some in underwear, fumbling with helmets and rifles. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The rifle platoon scrambled toward defensive positions that had never been properly fortified, because the front lines were 40 miles north. Jimmy stood frozen, watching the aircraft approach. They were twin-engine Junkers Ju-52s, German transport planes. Not bombers, transports. "Oh God," he whispered, "paratroopers." The first aircraft roared over the depot at 400 feet, and black shapes began tumbling from the open cargo doors. Dozens of them, then dozens more. Parachutes bloomed white against the dawn sky. 100, 150, 200 canopies descending toward Baker 7 like deadly snow. Fallschirmjäger, Hitler's elite airborne troops, the same soldiers who'd seized Crete, who'd held Monte Cassino, who'd earned a reputation as the Wehrmacht's most fanatical fighters. They jumped into combat, carrying 90 pounds of equipment, rifles, machine guns, explosives, ammunition for sustained assault. Their doctrine was brutal and direct: overwhelming violence in the first 5 minutes, seize key positions before defenders could organize, kill anyone who resisted. American rifles cracked, scattered, uncoordinated fire from the platoon. A few parachutes collapsed, bodies tumbling, but it was hopeless. The defenders were outnumbered 5-1, and the Germans were landing all around the perimeter, some inside the depot itself. The first Fallschirmjäger hit the ground 50 yards from Jimmy's mess tent. The soldier cut his parachute harness, grabbed his rifle, and sprinted toward the ammunition dump. More landed nearby. Disciplined, fast-moving, executing a rehearsed plan. The shooting intensified. Machine gun fire raked the tents. Explosions, grenades sent debris flying. Men screamed. The medical tent erupted in flames. Captain Robert Hayes, the depot commander from Massachusetts, appeared at Jimmy's elbow. The officer was 28 years old, West Point graduate, career military. His face was sheet white, hands trembling as he clutched his sidearm. "Sergeant Caldwell," Hayes said, voice tight with controlled panic, "we're being overrun. Intelligence estimated one company, maybe 60 hostiles. I'm counting 200-plus parachutes. We cannot hold this position." Jimmy stared at him, mind blank with terror. "Sir, I'm a cook. I need every man with a weapon. Grab your rifle and—" An explosion 30 yards away cut him off. Debris rained down. The captain ducked, then looked back at Jimmy with something desperate in his eyes. "The supply dump, Sergeant. They're heading for the fuel and ammunition. If they blow those stockpiles, they'll incinerate half the depot and everyone in it. We need to delay them. Anything to buy time for the reaction force to arrive from brigade. Radio says 45 minutes. We need to hold for 45 minutes. Jimmy looked at his mess tent. The fryers still bubbling, oil at 375 degrees, 300 gallons of it. Then he looked at the Germans advancing in tactical formations, leapfrogging between cover points, professional and lethal. An insane idea crystallized in his mind. Crazy. Suicidal, impossible. But James Caldwell hadn't come 5,000 miles from Kentucky to watch America lose because he was too afraid to try something desperate. "Captain," Jimmy said quietly, "I have a plan. It's going to sound crazy." Hayes looked at him. "I'm listening. How do you feel about 300 gallons of boiling oil?" The captain's eyes widened. For 3 seconds he stood frozen, then a grim smile crossed his face. "Sergeant, that might be the most insane thing I've heard all war. Do it." 05:02 hours. The battle had been raging for 15 minutes, and Baker 7 was dying. The rifle platoon was down to 31 effectives, pinned behind sandbag positions, ammunition running critically low. German machine gun teams had seized the water tower and motor pool, pouring suppressing fire across the depot's center. 2 ammunition tents were already captured. The fuel dump, 30,000 gallons of aviation gasoline and diesel, was 60 yards from the nearest German squad and completely undefended. Jimmy worked with frantic speed, hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the tools. Private Eddie Morrison and 4 other kitchen staff, none of them combat soldiers, all terrified beyond coherent thought, helped execute the plan that Jimmy was inventing in real time. The physics were simple but brutal. Oil at 375 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't just burn skin, it adheres to it, continues cooking flesh even after initial contact, causes third-degree burns in seconds. Water boils at 212 degrees, oil can reach 400 degrees before igniting. A splash of boiling water causes pain. A splash of boiling oil causes permanent disfigurement. Jimmy had 6 industrial fryers, each mounted on wheeled frames for mobility. They'd been designed for kitchen repositioning, to move equipment around the mess tent. Now those wheels would serve a darker purpose. "We're going to roll them," Jimmy said, voice hoarse. "Get the fryers as close to German positions as possible, then tip them over. The oil will spread. Gravity will carry it downhill toward the ammunition dump. Anyone in the path—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Eddie stared at him, face ashen. "Sarge, that's... Jesus Christ, that's... Eddie, those men out there are trying to blow up a fuel dump that will kill 300 Americans if it goes up. We don't have bullets, we don't have grenades, and we sure as hell don't have time. We have hot oil and desperation. That's the war we're fighting." And the first fryer weighed 400 pounds loaded. It took 4 men pushing to move it, wheels grinding against sand and gravel. They rolled it toward the eastern edge of the mess tent, where a natural slope descended toward the ammunition storage area. Germans were advancing up that slope in 2-man fire teams, using burned-out trucks and supply crates for cover. The nearest Germans were 40 yards away. Jimmy's plan required getting within 15 yards, close enough for the oil to reach them when poured, far enough to have a prayer of surviving the Germans' return fire. Captain Hayes had organized a desperate covering force, 12 men with rifles positioned behind whatever cover they could find. Their job was to suppress German fire long enough for Jimmy's team to position the fryers. "On my mark!" Hayes shouted. "Covering fire!" Rifles cracked. The Americans aimed not to kill, but to force Germans down, to buy 30 seconds of movement. "Go! Go! Go!" Jimmy screamed. They pushed the first fryer out of the tent, across open ground, wheels crunching sand. Bullets snapped past, that distinctive supersonic crack that meant rounds were coming within feet. Eddie sobbed as he pushed, tears streaming down his face, waiting for the bullet that would end everything. 20 yards, 30 yards. The fryer's wheels hit a rock and nearly tipped. If it had fallen there, the plan would have ended. 35 yards. Close enough. "Tip it!" Jimmy roared. 4 men heaved. The fryer tilted, balanced for one terrible second on 2 wheels, then toppled with a metallic crash. 50 gallons of oil at 375 degrees exploded across the slope. The liquid spread like a burning river, following gravity downhill, flowing around rocks and into depressions, seeking the lowest ground, exactly where German soldiers were positioned for their assault on the ammunition dump. The screaming started immediately. A German soldier, maybe 22 years old, carrying an MP-40 submachine gun, took the full wave of oil across his legs and torso. His uniform ignited instantly. He staggered backward, arms windmilling, voice rising to an inhuman shriek. He fell, rolled, but the oil clung to him, cooking through skin into muscle. His squad mates tried to help him, but touching him meant burning themselves. 2 more Germans caught in the oil flow abandoned their weapons and ran, beating at flames, consuming their uniforms. One collapsed after 15 yards, writhing on the ground. The other made it to a water barrel and plunged his burning arms inside. The water flash-boiled, steam erupting, his screaming somehow getting worse. The German advance on that section halted completely. Soldiers who'd been moving forward suddenly scattered, unwilling to advance through the burning oil spreading across their route. Officers shouted commands, but you can't order men to walk through hellfire. Jimmy stared at what he'd done, bile rising in his throat. The smell hit him, burning oil, scorched flesh, chemical stench of melting synthetic fabrics. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. "It's working," Eddie whispered, voice hollow with shock. "Oh God, it's actually working." No time for guilt, no time for horror. 5 more Friars to deploy. They went back for the second Friar, rolling it to a different position, this time targeting the German machine gun team that had seized the water tower's base. Again the covering fire, again the desperate sprint across open ground, again the Friar tipped and oil spreading like napalm. Another 50 gallons, another river of fire. More screaming. The machine gun went silent. The crew abandoned their position, one man's uniform smoking, all of them retreating from the oil that pooled around their sandbag position, seeping through gaps, finding them. 3rd Friar, 4th Friar. Each deployment was a new nightmare. Each time Jimmy watched men burn. Some died quickly, others didn't. The Germans who weren't hit directly were psychologically shattered by watching their comrades immolated. Elite training meant nothing against a weapon they'd never encountered, couldn't predict, couldn't counter. By 05:18, 4 Friars were deployed. 200 gallons of oil had been weaponized. Approximately 90 German soldiers had been burned, varying from minor scalding to fatal immolation. But the cost was mounting. Private Eddie Morrison took a bullet through his left shoulder, positioning the 4th Friar. He kept pushing through shock and blood loss until the job was done, then collapsed. 2 other kitchen staff were hit, one fatally. Captain Hayes was wounded, a graze across his ribs that he ignored as he directed covering fire. The 5th Friar jammed, wheels locked, wouldn't roll. Jimmy and 2 others physically carried it, 400 pounds dead weight, stumbling across open ground while bullets kicked up sand around them. When they tipped it, the oil splashed back on one American soldier, Private Daniel Foster from Nebraska, 20 years old. He screamed, fell, rolled through dirt trying to smother the burning oil coating his arm. Medics pulled him away, but the damage was done. The 6th and final Friar was the largest, a commercial unit holding 70 gallons. Jimmy saved it for the critical moment. German forces were regrouping, officers rallying their men for a coordinated push despite casualties. They'd identified the mess tent as the source of the oil attacks and were massing for an assault to eliminate it. 50 Germans moving in tactical formation, suppressing fire from multiple machine gun positions. This was their final push. If they took the mess tent, they'd neutralize the oil threat and resume their advance on the ammunition dump. Jimmy made a decision that would haunt his nightmares forever. He positioned the final Friar at the mess tent entrance, not to roll it forward, but to hold the position. When Germans closed within 20 yards, he'd tip it at the tent opening, creating a burning barrier they couldn't cross, a defensive line made of liquid fire. Joe 5, 23 hours. German command post, 200 yards northwest of Baker 7 Depot. Hauptmann Karl Richter, 31 years old, veteran of Crete and Tunisia, commander of the 3rd Company, 2nd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, stared through binoculars at the impossible disaster unfolding below. His mission briefing had been explicit: seize supply depot Baker 7, destroy ammunition and fuel stockpiles, withdraw before American reinforcements arrived. Intelligence estimated 40-50 defenders, minimal combat capability. Expected resistance time, 10 minutes. Expected casualties, minimal. Reality, 25 minutes of combat. Operation stalled. 90 men burned or wounded, and they still hadn't secured the objectives. Hauptmann, the men are refusing to advance through Sector 3. His second-in-command, Oberleutnant Werner Braun, looked shaken. Rare for a man who'd jumped into Crete under British artillery fire. They're saying the Americans are using chemical weapons. Something that burns through uniforms, ignites on contact. It's not chemical, Richter interrupted coldly. He'd finally identified the source. It's cooking oil. They're weaponizing kitchen equipment. Braun stared. Sir? Look at the deployment pattern. The burning areas originate from wheeled containers rolled from the mess facility. The American defenders aren't using flamethrowers or incendiaries. They're literally pouring hot cooking oil on our assault routes. The silence was profound. An elite airborne company, trained for the most difficult combat operations, feared across 3 theaters of war, was being stopped by kitchen supplies. That's insane, Braun finally said. That violates every principle of warfare. It's effective, Richter corrected bitterly. Conventional doctrine assumes conventional weapons. Nobody prepared us for this because nobody imagined this. What do you do when your enemy has no weapons but refuses to surrender? They improvise. They find whatever causes pain and turn it into an instrument of war. German military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force applied precisely. Combined arms, air support, artillery preparation, methodical assault. They trained for scenarios: urban combat, trench warfare, armored engagements, airborne operations. No training manual covered how to assault a position defended by industrial cooking equipment. The psychological impact was devastating. Fallschirmjäger were conditioned to accept casualties. Bullet wounds, shrapnel, even flame weapons were understood risks. But oil burns differently. They didn't kill cleanly. Men who took a round could be patched up. Men who'd been splashed with 375-degree oil were writhing on the ground, uniforms melting into their skin, flesh cooking from the inside out, screaming in a way that broke the spirit of soldiers watching. And the screaming didn't stop. 3 men burned in the first oil deployment were still alive 20 minutes later, their cries echoing across the depot. Medics couldn't help them. There was no treatment for burns covering 60% of the body in a field medical station. Morphine dulled the pain, but not enough. The wounded begged to be shot. Richter's men were veterans, but they were also human. Watching comrades burn alive, knowing that oil could splash onto you from 15 yards away, that you couldn't see it coming, couldn't dodge it, couldn't survive it, was breaking unit cohesion. New orders, Richter said grimly. Bypass Sector 3 entirely. We'll take the long approach, circle around to the fuel dump from the west. The Americans can't have infinite oil. They've already deployed most of their supply. We'll avoid direct assault on the mess area, flank it, hit the objectives from an unexpected vector. It was tactically sound. It was also an admission. A German airborne company was being outmaneuvered by a cook. Meanwhile, 60 yards away, behind the mess tent, Sergeant Jimmy Caldwell was preparing his final stand. 5 fryers had been deployed and emptied. The 6th, the largest, 70 gallons still boiling, sat at the tent entrance. Jimmy had maybe 45 seconds before Germans came through that canvas door. His hands were blistered from handling the hot fryer. His glasses were cracked, vision blurred. Blood from a shrapnel cut across his forehead ran into his eyes. He was out of oil, out of time, out of options. Captain Hayes appeared beside him, left side soaked red, face grey with blood loss. "Reaction force ETA 5 minutes, the captain said through clenched teeth. "We just have to hold 5 more minutes." "Sir, they're flanking west. They'll hit the fuel dump before..." The tent wall exploded inward. German soldiers, 3 of them, burst through canvas, rifles raised, shouting in German. Jimmy didn't think. He shoved the massive fryer. It tipped, 70 gallons of oil cascading directly toward the breaching Germans. 2 soldiers caught the full wave. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. Uniforms ignited. Skin bubbled. Both men fell screaming, rifles forgotten, clawing at their own faces. The 3rd German backpedaled through the torn canvas, shouting warnings, firing blindly. The oil spread across the tent floor, pooling around supply crates, dripping through gaps in the floorboards. The entire structure was now essentially a fire hazard. One spark and the whole thing would erupt. Jimmy stood in the center of the spreading oil, watching the two German soldiers writhe and burn 3 feet away. One locked eyes with him, blue eyes, maybe 19 years old, choking on smoke and agony, hand reaching out in supplication or accusation. Jimmy watched him die. The psychological break wasn't immediate, it was cumulative. First, oil deployment, horror and necessity. Second, justification through survival. Fifth, mechanical dissociated action. Sixth, staring into the eyes of a boy you're burning alive and realizing you've become something monstrous. The firing outside intensified suddenly. Not German weapons, American, heavier caliber coordinated volleys, the 30 caliber machine guns of the reaction force. The reinforcements had arrived. 05:51 hours. Allied Supply Depot Baker 7, 47 minutes after first German parachute deployed. The firing stopped, not gradually, abruptly, like a switch flipped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the gunfire, broken only by the moaning of wounded men, the crackle of small fires, and that terrible persistent screaming of burned Germans that wouldn't stop. Jimmy Caldwell sat on the ground outside the smouldering mess tent, back against a supply crate, hands limp in his lap. His glasses were gone, lost somewhere in the chaos. Without them, the world was a blur of smoke and shapes. Maybe that was better. Maybe he didn't want to see clearly. The reaction force, Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, had arrived with 180 men, 2 light tanks, and a fury born of knowing they'd almost been too late. The remaining German paratroopers, already demoralized by oil casualties and failed objectives, broke contact and withdrew. Some surrendered, most scattered into the desert. The operation was over. Final casualty count, American side, 14 killed, 31 wounded. The depot was damaged but intact. The ammunition dump, the Germans' primary objective, was untouched. The fuel stockpile that would have incinerated half the depot if ignited remained secure. German casualties, 47 killed, 113 wounded. Of those wounded, 87 had suffered burns from boiling oil, ranging from second-degree scalding to horrific full-body immolation. The German medics moving among their wounded looked at the American defenders with something beyond hatred, revulsion, horror at what had been done. Captain Hayes, arm in a sling, blood-soaked uniform being treated by medics, found Jimmy in the aftermath. The captain sat down heavily beside him. "Brigade Command is calling it the Caldwell Defense," Hayes said quietly. "You stopped an elite airborne assault with kitchen equipment. They're talking about medals, Silver Star, maybe higher. Press is already getting word. You're going to be famous, Sergeant." Jimmy didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something Hayes couldn't see, a young German soldier's face, blue eyes wide with agony and incomprehension in the moment before death. "How many?" Jimmy finally asked, voice hollow. "Burned? Intelligence counted 87 verified, maybe more. You probably saved 200 American lives today. The ammunition dump alone, I burned 87 men alive." The captain fell silent. What could he say? That it was war, that they were the enemy, that it was justified, all true, all irrelevant to the man sitting beside him, hands still shaking, mind replaying each moment. Someone had screamed because of what he'd done. The reporters came. 3 correspondents embedded with the reaction force, notebooks ready, eager for the story of the cook who'd turned kitchen into arsenal. Jimmy gave them nothing, wouldn't talk, wouldn't pose for photos. Captain Hayes handled the interviews instead, carefully framing the narrative. Desperate defense, American ingenuity under pressure, the indomitable spirit that turned cooks into warriors. The headlines back home ran for a week. Kentucky cook's kitchen arsenal stops Nazi elite. From fry pan to frying Nazis. American ingenuity wins again. Boiling oil bath scalds German paratroopers. The stories were celebratory, triumphant, exactly the morale boost America needed. Jimmy's diner back in Bowling Green became a tourist destination. His photo appeared in Life magazine. James Caldwell refused to read any of it. The immediate aftermath was bureaucratic machinery. Jimmy was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The The ceremony was quiet. No press, his request. The medal went into a drawer where he'd never look at it. Private Eddie Morrison, wounded but alive, received the Bronze Star. 3 kitchen staff who'd helped deploy the friars were commended. Private Daniel Foster, who'd been burned by splashback, recovered after 4 months in a military hospital with permanent scarring on his left arm. The military studied the engagement obsessively. Staff officers analyzed every tactical detail, wrote doctrine papers about improvised defensive weapons, discussed whether Caldwell's technique could be replicated. The answer was complicated. Yes, it could work again, but required specific terrain, specific circumstances, and a defender desperate enough to do something horrifying. Some officers called it brilliance. Others called it barbarism. Most called it necessary. The German survivors told a different story, the ones who could still speak. Interrogations revealed the psychological devastation. Fallschirmjäger were trained to accept violence, expect casualties, face death with discipline. The oil had broken something in them, not their bodies, but their certainty. They'd believed in their superiority, their training, their doctrine. A cook with kitchen equipment had revealed it as illusion. Hauptmann Karl Richter, captured during the withdrawal, gave the most chilling assessment. We jumped into hell, but hell was created by a man who should never have been a warrior. Your cook didn't fight like a soldier. He fought like someone defending his home from invaders. That's the difference between us. We're professionals executing a mission. He was a man protecting something he believed in. Professional soldiers can be broken. True believers cannot. The psychiatric impact on Jimmy emerged slowly, over months. He completed his tour in North Africa, continued serving as a cook, but stopped talking about May 20th. Fellow soldiers noticed he'd stand outside the mess tent at dawn, staring at nothing. He'd flinch at the sound of oil boiling. Once during a routine breakfast service, he froze mid-motion, staring at the fryer until someone physically moved him away. The war ended. Jimmy returned to Bowling Green, Kentucky in October 1945. The town threw a parade. He smiled, shook hands, said the right words. Then he reopened his diner. For 3 months he tried to cook, tried to stand in front of the industrial fryer and prepare fried chicken like he had 1,000 times before the war. He couldn't. The smell of hot oil triggered flashbacks so severe he'd vomit. The sound of oil bubbling became the sound of men screaming. He sold the diner in 1946. For 20 years, James Caldwell didn't speak publicly about May 20th, 1943. Journalists who tracked him down were politely refused. Historians researching the engagement got silence. The Silver Star stayed in a drawer. The only person he'd talked to was Dr. Raymond Ellis, a VA psychiatrist in Louisville who specialized in treating combat veterans with severe moral injury. The emerging diagnosis for soldiers haunted not by what was done to them, but by what they'd done to others. "I didn't kill them cleanly," Jimmy told Dr. Ellis in a 1952 session, transcript later declassified. "A bullet, that's war. What I did, that was something else. I watched them burn, I smelled them burning. One of them looked at me while he died, and I saw in his eyes that he knew I'd done this deliberately. Not in combat heat. I had positioned that fryer, calculated the spread, timed it. I'd designed his death. What does that make me?" The historical reassessment came in the 1960s. Military historians studying unconventional tactics revisited the Caldwell defense. Academic papers analyzed it as early asymmetric warfare, a preview of Vietnam-era improvised weapons. The oil tactic was taught at Fort Benning as an example of adaptive thinking under pressure. Jimmy's name entered military education, an example of victory through improvisation. In 1968, the Army invited Jimmy to speak at the Command and General Staff College. He was 59 years old, grey-haired, wearing reading glasses identical to the ones he'd lost in Tunisia 25 years earlier. He stood before 200 officers and delivered a 10-minute speech that became legendary. "You want to know about May 20th? I'll tell you. I burned 87 men because I was too terrified to let them kill me and everyone I was responsible for. I used cooking oil because I had nothing else. It worked. I saved lives, stopped an enemy assault, did my duty, and it destroyed something in me that never came back. You want to teach that tactic? Fine. But teach them the cost too. Teach them that every effective weapon carries a price, and sometimes the price is your soul. I'd do it again, had to be done, but I'd give anything to live in a world where it didn't have to be done. That's what war really costs. Not just the enemy you kill, but the part of yourself you kill in the killing. He sat down to silence. Then the officers stood, not applause, but respect for honesty. James Caldwell died in 1979, aged 70, from heart failure. He was buried in Bowling Green with full military honors. The Silver Star was finally pinned to his uniform for the funeral, his daughter's decision. 3 German veterans attended, men who'd survived the oil assault. They stood at attention as taps played, then approached the casket. One left a handwritten note. You were a worthy enemy. You did what you had to. So did we. May we both find peace. The legacy is complicated. Military manuals include the Caldwell defense as historical footnote. Some call it brilliance, others call it atrocity. The truth is simpler. It was a desperate man, armed only with what he had, refusing to surrender. That's the essence of every defensive victory, someone deciding that retreat is not an option, then improvising survival from whatever materials exist. The deeper legacy is what it revealed about American character in extremis, the ability to innovate when conventional options fail, the determination to fight with anything available, the refusal to accept defeat even when outgunned. Those are the traits that won World War II, not just industrial might or military doctrine, but the foundational belief that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when everything depends on it. Jimmy Caldwell was a cook from Kentucky who never wanted to be a soldier. When war forced the choice on him, he did what Americans have always done. He found a way. The cost was measured not in enemy casualties or tactical victories, but in nightmares that lasted 36 years, in a diner he could never reopen, in a Silver Star he couldn't look at. He paid that price willingly because the alternative was watching his brothers-in-arms die while he did nothing. That's heroism without glory, doing the necessary thing, bearing the unbearable cost, living with the consequences for the rest of your life. The untold stories of World War II aren't always about famous battles or legendary generals. They're about ordinary people facing impossible choices and finding courage in unexpected places. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more forgotten heroes whose actions changed history. What other unsung Wout stories do you want to hear? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Every week, we bring you the human stories behind the history books. Don't miss the next one. Subscribe now and ring that notification bell. This is history that deserves to be remembered.